Next, we are going to create the NS Managed Object subclasses for category and expense.
With the Core Data Model Inspector selected, go up to Editor and go down to Create NS Managed Object subclass from the menu bar. Once you select that, select the data model. This is the same name that it showed over here in the XC data model D file. Click Next and ensure that both entities or all entities that you are trying to create are selected. Click Next and change the group from categorical expenses project file to the actual categorical expenses group file and click Create. What this will do is it will generate 2 files per entity, one for the core data class and one with the core data properties. And let's examine those properties right now. Expense core data properties has name, amount, raw date, and then notice it has a category attribute. If we go back to the data model inspector, with expense, notice it only has 3 attributes, but it also has a relationship. A property is actually generated for that relationship. And again, it's called category of type category. Now let's take a look at the category entity and the generated subclass. When I select properties, we have 2 properties, one for the title of string and one of raw expenses of type NS ordered set. NS ordered set is again an array essentially, or it's a set actually, of all of our expenses. Since core data is backed by Objective-C, we will eventually need to turn this into an array of expenses. Now that we've examined the properties of our entities, let's create some convenience initializers and some computed properties. I'm going to navigate to Expense Core Data Class, and here's our opportunity to create a computed property for our date and a convenience initializer to actually create this expense class. Very first thing I'm going to do is create the computed property for date. So var date is of type date optional. Then we're going to create a getter for this computed property, which will return our raw date as date. Next, we're going to create a setter, which takes our new value and assigns it to raw date. So raw date equals new value as NS date. With this computed property, we can now treat this date property essentially as our date that will actually be persisted to core data. And now is our opportunity to create a convenience initializer. So convenience init, and this will actually be a failable initializer. So right after init, I'm going to put a question mark. And for parameters, I'm going to take name, which is of type string, amount, which is of type double, and date, which is of type date optional. Then I'm going to create a constant to access our app delegate. And to access our app delegate, we actually need to import UIKit instead of foundation. So let's go up to line 10 and change foundation to UIKit. And let's go back to our convenience initializer and say let app delegate equals UI application dot shared dot delegate as question mark app delegate. Now that we have our app delegate, let's get our context, and let's actually do getting our context in a guard statement. So guard let context equals app delegate dot persistent container dot view context, else let's return nil. Essentially what this is saying is we need to get the app delegate, and then from the app delegate we need to get our persistent container, which contains our managed object context. If we can't get our managed object context, we're essentially going to fail out of this initializer and move on with our code. But if we do get the context, we then need to call our own initializer, so self.init, which takes in an entity description and an NS managed object context. We have the NS managed object context, so let's essentially fill that in with context. And now we need to fill it in with an entity description, which is expense, capital expense, entity. And that generates an entity description for you. After this, we have actually created an instance of our expense class, and this has been saved to our context, so let's initialize its parameters. So self.name equals name, self.amount equals amount, and self.date equals date. Notice that in the expense core data properties, we have a category property that we're not actually initializing in this initializer. This is perfectly all right because essentially when we create an expense, we're going to immediately assign it to a category and not via the initializer, so that's perfect. Now let's navigate to the category core data class and initialize a computed property for this as well as a convenience initializer as well. So let's do the computed property. So var, and this is going to be of type, this is going to be named expenses and be of type an array of expense, and this is going to actually be optional. And let's take a look at our core data properties. Our job is to get these raw expenses that are type NS ordered set to an array of expenses. So that's what we're going to do in this computed property. So let's return and let's access our raw expenses dot array as an array of expense. So now if we ever want to get an array of expenses from our category instance, we can simply access expenses property and get an array of expenses. Now that we have that, let's create a convenience initializer for this by typing convenience init. Again, this is going to be failable. Parameters are going to be title of type string, and that's it. And let's get our app delegate. And again, since I need to import UI kit instead of foundation, so let app delegate equals UI application dot shared dot delegate as app delegate. Then guard let context equals app delegate dot persistent container dot view context else return nil. And let's call our initializer self.init with the entity description of category dot entity inserted into our context. And now self.title equals title. At this time, we've created convenience initializers for both category and expense, and we've also created computed properties to make handling Objective-C types a lot easier.